If you enjoy the story, give it a like and feel free to leave a comment. Also, be sure to subscribe and click the bell icon to be the first to hear new Cryptid Tales. I'm always looking for stories to share, so if you've had your own encounter with the unknown, send me an email at cryptidtalesmail@gmail.com.
We hadn't been out of town since the summer before last, when we went to our family's yearly 4th of July get-together at the lake. When life takes a hold of you by the collar, it has a way of leading you around, dragging you farther and farther away from the things you used to enjoy about life, such as weekend getaways to the woods, camping, hiking, fishing. Those things end up getting replaced by hours wasted away in front of a computer, staring at a phone, or binging on Netflix. I had finally had enough of the drone of the computer fan spinning and the blue light frying my brain late into the night. Honestly, I was expecting a bit more excitement from her when I had brought up the idea of a weekend camping trip. I could tell by the lack of expression in her eyes that it wasn't really her top choice, but she agreed and pretended to be as excited as I was, if only in her words. I grabbed the tent bag and shoved it up against the rest of the pile as I crammed the hatch down on the back of the SUV. I stood there for a second and gave the handle a pull, convincing myself that it wouldn't fly open as we went down the highway. I looked through the side window at the mound of assorted bags and totes as I went through my mental checklist to make sure we didn't forget anything. "Is that everything?" she yelled from the door. "Yeah, I think that's it," as I completed the checklist in my head. 10 minutes later, we were merging onto the highway and headed for a weekend in the woods, just the two of us. As I put the skyline of the city in my rear view, I couldn't help but notice how quickly the buildings and houses started to disappear. We were only 30 minutes or so away from our front doorstep, and already I was seeing fields and patches of trees, even a few cattle and horses here and there. I started to daydream about what it must be like to live outside of the city and to have animals like that. I laughed to myself at the idea of how strange it seemed to me that other people still live like that, even though humans were living that way 100 years ago. If anything, I was the strange one for not having cows and riding horses. She stayed glued to her phone for most of the 2-hour drive, which was fine. I didn't mind the silence that much. It was nice to just zone out on the road and have my thoughts to myself for a change. We had made pretty decent time, only stopping once at a gas station. It was more to stretch our legs and use the facilities than the need for gas. It was early evening when we pulled off the main road and onto the forest road. I couldn't believe how much darker it got once we drove into the trees after being out on the open road. It must have registered with her as well. She put her phone in the cup holder and stared out the window. "Wow, all you can see is trees," she said with a tone of being taken back by the sight. "Definitely not the same view you have at home," I replied back as I took a look around for myself. "It's kind of funny. I actually found out about the place we were headed to on the internet of all places." I couldn't help but see the irony in that. I mean, technically, it was somebody going by the name of Off-Trail Hiker on a camping and hiking internet forum, but it was still amusing to me. After they showed me the general area on Google Maps, I was impressed. It wasn't far from where we lived, and it was the definition of remote. There were no houses or businesses around for miles. It was exactly what I was looking for. They had told me to look for a pull-off on the left about 7 miles off the main road. I passed by it the first time and ended up turning back around after about 15 miles. The second time I went a little slower and she spotted the turnoff. It was about twice the size of a hiking trail, and it was no wonder that I had driven right by it the first time. The little road turned back to the right and went down a hill a short distance before opening up into a large clearing surrounded by tall trees. There was a huge rock, almost as big as our SUV, right at the opening, and a small stream ran along the back of the clearing, just inside the tree line. It was like something out of a Bob Ross painting. "Can you believe this? This is amazing," she said as she started snapping pics with her phone. It was nice to hear some excitement in her voice about the trip finally, but she was right. It really was an amazing place. I was already starting to feel more relaxed than I had been in a very long time. The healing power of nature is truly something. I wasn't a complete novice at camping. I had gone quite a bit when I was younger, but I was still impressed with myself after the tent was set up and the fire was going. Shelter and fire are the two most important things to survival, or something like that. Or was it food and water? Granted, I was no Bear Grylls, but when a man builds and creates a fire, it feels like a major accomplishment. That night, we dined on the finest hot dogs cooked over an open fire, followed by toasted marshmallows for dessert. The sky was clear, and the stars shimmered just beyond the light of the campfire. It was perfect. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night and crawled out of the tent. The fire had died down to a pile of glowing chunks, so I threw a few sticks on top and poked around in the coals until they lit up into flames again. The wood popped and buzzed as it burned. I took a seat in one of the camp chairs and stared into the flames. It was one of my favorite things about camping. I could hear the trickling of the stream behind me. The whole scene was almost hypnotic, and I quickly found myself dozing off in the chair. The fire popped again, loudly, and jolted me back awake. As my eyes flew open, I thought I saw something move over by the big rock. I stared over towards where I thought I saw something, but I wasn't sure of what I even saw. It could have just been shadows being cast from the fire. I sat there for a while more, staring at the fire, but every now and then looking back towards that big rock. I don't know what it was really, but something just seemed off about it. Other than that one time, I hadn't seen anything else, but for some reason I was starting to become somewhat unsettled, even a little nervous. Maybe it was me being used to the city, not having the power to just turn on the lights. Maybe it was the way the light of the campfire rippled off the face of the huge boulder, or maybe it was the way that everything beyond the rock was concealed in complete darkness. There was something, just something about it. There, at the edge of the rock was a shadow, a part of the rock that stuck out on the side but was past the reach of the light from the fire. But that's what was bothering me. Was it the rock? It looked almost like something crouching down next to the rock, maybe a little bit behind it. It had to just be part of the rock in the shadows. That's all it was. I was sitting out here in the middle of the woods at night. I was half asleep, and I was spooking myself. But it just looked so... It really did look like something crouched next to the rock, as much as it looked like part of the rock itself. I couldn't tell what I was looking at, whether it was just the situation or the bottled water catching up with me. I needed to relieve myself. I held it for as long as I could, not wanting to take my eyes off the mystery shadow, but eventually nature always wins. I stood up, still fixated on the shadow. Nothing happened, no movement. It had to just be part of the boulder. I stepped over to a tree at the back corner of the tent. I couldn't go fast enough. Now that my back was turned to the rock and the shadow, a chill ran up my spine. I felt like something was going to grab me at any moment. My ears strained to listen past the sound of the stream bubbling and the sound of my own urination. When I finished, I quickly zipped up my pants and took a deep breath, telling myself to relax. But as I turned back around, I couldn't help but immediately look for the shadow at the edge of the boulder. As my eyes focused on the spot, it felt like someone sucked the air straight out of my lungs. The shadow was gone. I slowly walked towards the fire as goosebumps ran up both my arms. It was gone. The rock, the shadow, whatever it wasn't there anymore. I was sure of it. What was going on? I grabbed a few more sticks and laid them on the fire. The area lit up brightly, and now I was even more certain. The shape I had been staring at was completely gone. Something had been there that entire time. But what? I wasn't really sure how big the thing was, whatever it was. I was somewhat sure it was at least the size of a person. A bear, maybe? Did we even have bears in this area? It couldn't have been a deer. I had seen those plenty of times, and they certainly don't crouch down by rocks and watch people, or whatever that thing had been doing. Not knowing what it was or why it had been there did not help matters at all. But at least it was gone, whatever it was. Or was it? Was it gone, or did it just move somewhere else? I looked around nervously, straining my eyes to focus on the different patches of darkness that faded into the expanse of trees around our camp. But it was a pointless endeavor. I couldn't see anything. I decided it was best to just accept that whatever animal it was gone now. I took one last look over my shoulder before crawling back inside the tent and laying down next to my wife, who was still unconscious to the world. I laid there for what seemed like hours, staring up at the roof of the tent, hanging on every little sound outside. Nothing sounded what most would consider frightening or menacing. But after what had happened outside, I couldn't help but let my imagination run wild. I fumbled around in the near darkness until I found my wife's phone and pressed the button to turn the clock on. 3:18 a.m. it read in big bluish-green numbers. Are you kidding me? It was still at least another 3 hours until sunrise? I thought to myself about how ridiculous I was being. I had to get some sleep. It was just an animal of some kind, probably more afraid of me than I was of it. Which, the thought of that was obviously a lie. I had been terrified, and I didn't even know what I was being terrified of. I'm not sure if I had finally drifted off, or if I was still barely awake. But when I gained my senses, I heard the end of a series of loud noises coming from deep in the woods behind us. It sounded like something smacking two rocks together, 3 or 4 times maybe. I wasn't sure of the number, but I was sure of the sound, and it sent that chill right back down my spine again, a feeling I was becoming all too familiar with that night. I laid there listening, and after a few moments it sounded like another short series of someone smacking two rocks together. I counted 3 times, but these were in a completely different direction, back off towards my wife's side of the tent. The scariest part about it was the second time seemed much closer than the first. I should have woken her up right then and told her what was going on, or I could have lied to her and told her I was feeling sick. Anything to justify packing up and getting the hell out of there. But I didn't. What was my justification? I had seen a shadow. I had heard some sounds. I sat there on my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds outside. After the rock smacking, I had heard it once more, from behind us again, but closer this time than the first. There was no response that time. At first, I thought I was just hearing the sound of the stream, but the sound grew louder and louder and came closer and closer until I realized what I was hearing. Something, or someone, was walking in the stream. I could hear the sound of the water giving way as something dragged its feet through the current. Just when the steps got even with our tent, they stopped. Not long, a couple seconds or so, and then they continued on, but with a quickening pace. Then, before the sound of the watery strides had faded out of hearing range, They abruptly stopped again. I turned my head, pointing an ear towards the direction they were headed. Had they stopped, or did they step out of the stream? All I could hear was the quiet of the night. Maybe it was just a deer. I tried to convince myself. But why would a deer be walking down the middle of a stream at night? And why would a deer sound like a person walking through the water? I was completely out of my element. I knew that, but I wasn't crazy. Like I said, I had gone on plenty of camping trips when I was younger, and I had never experienced anything like what was going on. Something about the entire thing just felt completely wrong. A few minutes later, and my gut instincts would be proven correct. From up above the camp, where the road was that we turned off of, a high-pitched cry cut through the air. If you could imagine what a banshee must sound like, that's what I heard. It wasn't a moan or a scream or a yell, but a combination of all three. I jerked in response as a noise forced its way out of my throat. I was so startled and fixated on the fear that was now grasping me that I didn't even notice my wife was now awake and sitting up as well. "What was that? Was that a coyote?" she asked in a hoarse voice. I didn't answer until she said my name, looking for an answer. I'm not sure. I mean, yeah, maybe. It was not a coyote. We both sat there listening, like we were waiting for something to happen, and it did. My wife noticed it first. "Do you hear that? Who's out there?" she said with her tired eyes quickly expanding with fear. There were voices, or a voice, but it sounded like it was talking to someone. It was a deep voice, coming from the top of the hill where the cry had come from. You couldn't make out any words, though, and it sounded almost muffled, but it was definitely someone saying something. My wife grabbed my arm with a firm grip, and I knew I had to do something. Someone was out there. Was it this mystery person that had been sneaking around camp the whole night? And who was with them? Who were they talking to? The best thing to do at the time seemed to be create as much light as possible. I asked my wife for the flashlight, and I could see the response in her expression before the words ever came out. It was in the car. The only thing I could do is throw a bunch of wood on the fire, let it flare up, and then go get the flashlight from the car. Plus, one press of the button on the key fob, and the headlights would come on. My wife and I crawled out of the tent, and I immediately started grabbing wood and tossing it on the fire. My wife hit the key fob, illuminating the entire camp area. As the fire started to flicker and grow into flames, I started walking over towards the SUV to grab the flashlight, with my wife right behind me. With each step closer to the SUV, we were getting closer to where the voice and cry had come from as well. My steps felt heavy with fear, but I didn't want my wife to know how afraid I actually was. As I approached the back hatch, I glanced up towards the top of the hill. There at the top, where the tree line stopped, I could see two bright amber-colored eyes reflecting the light of the campfire below. They were staring right at us. I quickly turned and looked at my wife, who was holding her phone up trying to illuminate the interior of the back seat, I assume looking for the flashlight. "You know what? Let's just get in the car and figure out what we want to do," I commanded more than suggested to her, but she didn't put up an argument. She unlocked the doors and we climbed in, relocking the doors behind us. From inside the SUV, I couldn't see up the hill anymore, so I had no idea if the thing was still up there watching us or not. All I knew for certain was that human eyes don't look that way in the dark. My wife checked the phone for a signal, saying something about calling the police. To her, it was still someone out in the middle of the woods at night, but I knew it was something else, something way worse than that. I reminded her that if she could even get a call out, the police would have to find the place, and it could be a very long wait before they got there. Our best option at this point was to just stay the rest of the night in the car and wait for the sun to come up. My hope was that whatever was out there would leave once the sun came up. And if something happened, at least we were in the car and could get out of there in a hurry. She agreed and handed me the keys as she laid her seat back. I stuck the key in the ignition and the headlights clicked off. The campfire bathed the car in an orange heatless glow. Sunrise couldn't get there quick enough. I had adjusted the rearview mirror so I could get a better view out the back window. I wanted to be able to see if anything came up behind us. Periodically, I'd press on the brake, lighting up the trail road behind us, making sure that thing, whatever it was, wasn't there. I also thought that if it was still watching us, lighting up the brakes might keep it away. I don't know if it was from the exhaustion of the repeated releases of adrenaline caused by the fear, or just from pure lack of sleep, but at some point I had somehow dozed off. I don't remember even feeling tired. All I remember is waking up to the feeling of my wife's fingers digging into my thigh, squeezing harder and harder. Finally, I realized what was going on and opened my eyes. It was still mostly dark outside, but the sky was just turning gray somewhere on the horizon. The fire had died completely down, and just a couple of small glowing embers were producing a small stream of smoke. I looked down at my wife's hand on my leg, her knuckles white as she dug into my leg. I turned my head towards her, and she was still reclined back in the seat. I'll never forget the look on her face. Even in the little amount of light we had, I could see the absolute sheer terror on her face. Her lips were clamped shut, as if preventing a scream from pouring out, and her tear-filled eyes were fixated not on me, but the passenger side window. As my focus fell towards the window, my heart jumped into my throat, and my stomach plummeted downward. Staring down at her through the window was this thing, this hideous creature that I had never seen before. It was hunched over so it could see into the window, its face just a few inches from the glass. The thing had large, dark, almond-shaped eyes, sunken in, and underneath a large, protruding brow. Long, dangling gray hair coming off its head, hanging over its bony shoulders. Sparse facial hair covered its face, except for around the mouth, which was slightly open. It had a cleft upper lip on one side, and you could see large, broken teeth poking out of swollen gums. The nose looked almost human and almost animal, or a mixture of the two. The skin was lighter in tone and looked very worn, almost chapped. You could see bits of skin peeling away and flaking off in some areas. With each breath it took, it fogged a spot on the window. The creature cocked its head and turned its attention to me. Without taking my eyes off it, I reached for the key and turned on the ignition. When the car started, the creature turned and bolted off into the trees. It was completely naked from head to toe, and the same sparse hair that covered its face hung from the rest of its body. As it ran away, I could tell it was much taller than a human, maybe by a foot or more, and the arms were longer than they should have been. They hung way down by its knees as it ran. My wife sat up in her seat, tears now bursting out and running down her cheeks. "Go, go, go," she said, crying hysterically. I put the car into gear and flicked the headlights over to high beams. Standing across the camp from us, behind our tent, was another one of the creatures. The top of our tent came up to just above its waistline. It had to have been at least 8 feet tall. I couldn't make out as much detail with it being that far away, but being exposed by the high beams, I could see it somewhat clearly. The hair was a different color on this one, almost a light brown. The hair on the body was darker and thinner than on its head. The same sparse type facial hair hung down off its jawline and chin. Once again, the skin was a lighter tone, but not as rough looking as the other one. The eyes were large, but reflected the headlights brightly, giving them an eerie light orange glow. It raised one of its long arms up and shielded the light from its face. I could see pointed yellowish claws sticking out past the tips of its fingers. Both of the creatures seemed skinny for their size, almost lanky, but that didn't take anything away from their terrifying appearances. I had seen enough. I wheeled the car around, kicking up dirt and grass as I floored it back up the hill. The car almost spun out of control as I turned out onto the forest road leading out of the area. I somehow managed to regain control and pressed the pedal hard against the floor as my wife continued sobbing in the seat next to me. I didn't ease up on the gas until I saw the stop sign at the intersection of the main road. I pulled up to the sign and looked at my wife, who was now wiping the tears from her face on the sleeve of her oversized sweatshirt. Before I could ask her what she wanted to do, she read my mind and told me to just go to the gas station we saw on the way in. Frank's Gas and More. The sign glowed in the early morning sky, like a lighthouse leading us back to the safety of civilization. I parked the car on the side of the building and turned off the ignition. It didn't look like Frank had made it into work yet, and the parking lot was still empty. "What the hell were those things?" my wife asked as she stared blankly out the car window. I didn't know how to answer her. The truth was, I didn't have any idea what those creatures were, other than monsters. That's exactly what they were. They were monsters. But I knew that's not what she meant. I just sat there quietly for a few moments before asking her what she wanted to do. After a brief conversation, we decided that once traffic picked up and the sun was up in the sky, we would drive back to our campsite and gather our belongings before heading home. Surely those things would be gone by then. A creature like that is certainly a creature of the night. Aren't all monsters? The drive back to the camp was a quiet one. Both of us were lost in our own thoughts about the events that had taken place, and the hope that the monsters would be gone when we arrived. I felt a lump form in my throat, and beads of sweat formed on my forehead as I turned back onto the forest road. 7 more miles, I thought to myself. My head flooded with doubts as my stomach twisted itself into knots. What were we thinking? This was ridiculous. Why were we going back there? We had escaped. Let's count our losses and get back to the city. At least there the monsters are human, and not whatever those things were. We pulled off onto the trail and headed down the curve into the campsite. As it came into view, it was like pulling into a crime scene. The entire thing was surreal. Our picturesque getaway had been transformed into something out of a horror movie. I put the SUV in park and scanned the area for any signs of the monsters before getting out. We both stood at the front of the car, taking in the scene that was laid out before us. We're just a couple hours before our lives were changed forever. The campsite was in complete disarray. The chairs laid broken on opposite sides of the camp. The ice chest was flipped over, and the lid was hanging on one hinge. Pieces of firewood and rocks were strewn about, and our tent was barely standing on one pole, the fabric ripped to shreds. Hanging on one of the trees was my sleeping bag, with stuffing pouring from an open rip, like the guts hanging out of a freshly butchered animal. We walked side by side around the camp, examining the remnants of our belongings. The food from the ice chest was all gone, except for a couple of water bottles. The chairs were completely broken, the fabric torn. After closer inspection of the tent, there appeared to be what looked like claw marks that had just shredded the fabric. We found a couple of smaller items. The power bank for the phone and my wife's book she had brought to read were laying nearby the stream. Her sleeping bag was nowhere to be found. I walked over to the tree where my torn sleeping bag was left hanging and pulled it to the ground. It smelled awful, but the odor I couldn't place. I could feel that the bag had some weight to it. Something was inside it. I looked at my wife, who was still picking through the pieces of the tent, before turning the bag over and dumping out the contents. Out rolled a horrific sight. At first, I was confused as to what I was even looking at. It didn't make sense at first, But then I saw the unmistakable ears, and I knew what I was looking at. It was the head of a rabbit, torn right off its body. A body that was nowhere to be seen. Why was there a dead rabbit's head in my sleeping bag? Another mystery that I didn't understand and knew I would never have the answer to. "Hey, what is that?" my wife asked. I jerked my head towards her, preparing to explain that it was a rabbit's decapitated head that had been stuffed inside my sleeping bag. But she wasn't looking at me or the rabbit's head. She was looking past me at the tree. I hadn't even noticed. Hidden on the tree trunk behind where my sleeping bag had been hanging was some sort of symbol scratched into the tree bark. What the hell was this? Was this there the day before? Or is this something those creatures had done? My wife walked over to me, completely ignoring the rabbit's head. We both stared up at the symbol as if it would suddenly reveal its meaning to us. The best I can describe it, the symbol looked like a crescent moon with 3 lines going across or out of the center. It was a very crude marking, but that's what it looked like. I kicked the sleeping bag over the rabbit's head laying on the ground and grabbed my wife by the hand. "Come on, let's get out of here," I said as I pulled her along towards the car. "What about the stuff?" she said. "We can't just leave it here like this." I disagreed. We could leave it there, and that's exactly what we were going to do. I didn't want to be there for another second, daylight or not. I may not have known what the rabbit's head or the strange symbol meant, but I understood the message. We were getting out of there and not looking back. Since then, I've tried looking up whatever I could on the internet. What the creatures looked like, the symbol on the tree. I even looked up if there was some sort of meaning behind a rabbit's head, but I never found any answers. I've listened to countless recordings of different animal calls, and nothing comes close to what we heard. I've even visited sites where people talk about Bigfoot, and while the descriptions are similar, the drawings and images I've looked at just aren't the same. I thought about looking up the person that originally told me about the spot, off-trail hiker, but decided against it. What would I say? There's no way they knew about those things being there or what would happen, right? Nobody knows about what happened or what we saw outside of my wife and I. We never told anyone, not even our families. When we feel like getting away, we go places that have hotels to stay in. The outdoors are no longer for us, and probably never will be again. I know it's ridiculous to think, but some nights, when I'm staring out the window at home or looking out into our backyard, I feel like one of those monsters is out there, staring back at me from the shadows.